Before we delve into tonight's chilling tale, a story of art, love, and a betrayal so profound it defies imagination, I want to welcome you to our channel. If you're a fan of mysteries that linger in your thoughts long after the story ends, of exploring the darkest corners of human nature, then you've found your home. We're about to unravel a crime that shocked the world, a story of greed that reached astronomical heights. But before we pull back the curtain on this shocking case, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button below. Turn on notifications, too, so you never miss an investigation into the shadows of the human soul. Your support allows us to keep bringing you these compelling narratives. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to hear the unbelievable story of the painter murdered by his wife for a staggering $4,000 billion. The world knew him as Alastair Finch, a painter of modest renown whose canvases captured the melancholic beauty of the forgotten corners of the world. His studio, a converted loft in a gentrifying part of the city, was a chaotic sanctuary of half-finished paintings, the air thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. To the handful of collectors who followed his work, Alastair was a purist, an artist unconcerned with the commercial whims of the art market. They saw a man dedicated to his craft, his passion a quiet, steady flame in a world obsessed with fleeting trends. They saw a man devoted to his wife, the elegant and enigmatic Isabella. What they didn't see, what no one saw until it was far too late, was the darkness that festered behind the idyllic facade of their life. A greed so potent it would curdle love into a poison of unimaginable toxicity. Isabella was, to all outward appearances, the perfect artist's wife. She was his muse, his manager, his most ardent supporter. It was she who organized his rare exhibitions, who schmoozed with gallery owners and potential buyers, her charm a stark contrast to Alastair's introverted nature. She had cultivated an image of herself as the practical one, the anchor that allowed her brilliant, dreamy husband to soar. Their love story was the stuff of local legend, the beautiful, ambitious gallery assistant who fell for the reclusive painter, their two worlds merging into a partnership that seemed both romantic and symbiotic. But beneath the surface of this carefully curated narrative, a different story was being written, one of secret resentments and a gnawing, insatiable hunger for more. Isabella had not always been a part of the art world. She came from a family of old money, a world of trust funds and summer homes, a world she had been unceremoniously cast out of after a youthful indiscretion that had scandalized her conservative parents. Her marriage to Alastair had been, in part, a rebellion, a way of thumbing her nose at the stuffy society she had once belonged to. But as the years went by, the thrill of bohemian life began to wane, replaced by a bitter longing for the luxury she had left behind. She loved Alastair, or at least she loved the idea of him. She was captivated by his talent, by the way he could translate the chaos of the world into something beautiful and profound. But love, she was beginning to realize, didn't pay the bills. Not in the way she wanted them paid, at least. They were comfortable, yes. Alastair's paintings sold for respectable sums, enough to afford their stylish loft and a life free from the daily grind of a 9-to-5 job. But comfortable was a world away from the extravagant lifestyle Isabella craved. She wanted couture, not just designer. She wanted a penthouse overlooking the park, not a loft in a neighborhood that was still up and coming. She wanted a life where money was no object, a life she felt she was owed. The first seeds of the monstrous idea that would eventually consume her were sown on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at a small, independent auction house. A minor work of Alastair's, a preparatory sketch for one of his larger paintings, had been put up for sale as part of an estate auction. Isabella had accompanied the elderly widow of the collector, more out of a sense of duty than any real interest. The sketch was expected to fetch a few $1,000s at most. But then something unexpected happened. Two bidders, both anonymous, began a frenzied bidding war over the piece. The price climbed higher and higher, past $10,000, then $50,000, then $100,000. A hush fell over the auction room as the numbers soared into territory usually reserved for established masters. When the gavel finally came down, the small charcoal sketch had sold for an astonishing $250,000. Isabella was stunned. She had always known Alastair was talented, but she had never comprehended the true monetary value of his work. That night, she couldn't sleep. The number kept replaying in her mind, $250,000. For a sketch, practice run. What, then, was the value of his finished paintings? The ones that lined the walls of their loft, the ones stacked in his studio, the ones he considered his masterpieces? Alistair, in his typical fashion, was bemused by the news. He found the astronomical price absurd, a symptom of the art market's irrationality. "It's just a sketch," he'd said with a shrug, more interested in the new shade of blue he was mixing for his latest work. His lack of excitement, his utter indifference to the fortune that was potentially at his fingertips, infuriated Isabella. It was then that she began to see his artistic integrity not as a virtue, but as a liability, an obstacle. Her obsession began in earnest. While Alistair painted, lost in his world of color and form, Isabella began her own project, a secret and meticulous cataloging of his entire life's work. She spent hours in his studio not as a supportive wife, but as an appraiser. She photographed every painting, every sketch, every notebook. She created a detailed inventory, noting the size, the date, the subject matter of each piece. Then, she took her research a step further. Using a fake name, she began to correspond with art historians, critics, and appraisers, sending them images of Alistair's work, seeking their expert opinions on its potential value. The responses she received were more staggering than she could have ever imagined. The experts were unanimous in their assessment. Alistair Finch was a genius, an undiscovered master whose work, if released to the market under the right circumstances, would be worth a fortune. One appraiser, a man from a prestigious international auction house, was particularly effusive in his praise. He compared Alistair's work to the great masters of the 20th century, claiming that his unique style, a blend of melancholic realism and dreamlike symbolism, was unlike anything he had ever seen. He estimated that the entire collection, if sold as a single posthumous body of work, could fetch a price that was almost incomprehensible. Posthumous, the word snagged in her mind, a tiny, venomous burr. It was a well-known fact in the art world that an artist's death almost always led to a significant increase in the value of their work. The tragedy of a life cut short, the finality of a finite collection, it was a narrative that collectors found irresistible. The appraiser, in a moment of professional hyperbole, had thrown out a number, a what-if scenario that was meant to illustrate the collection's immense potential. In the right market, he had written, with the right story, a collection this significant, this untouched, we could be looking at something in the realm of $4 billion. For billion. The number was so vast, so divorced from reality, that it seemed to hum in the air around her. It was a key that could unlock the life she had always dreamed of, the life she felt she had been cheated out of. It was a number worth killing for. From that moment on, something inside Isabella shifted. The lingering affection she had for Alistair began to curdle into something cold and calculating. She no longer saw him as her husband, but as an asset, a living, breathing portfolio of unimaginable wealth. His every cough, every sigh, every complaint of fatigue became a source of both anxiety and a dark, twisted hope. She began to subtly, insidiously, take control of every aspect of his life. She managed his diet, ostensibly for his health, but in reality, she was looking for ways to weaken his constitution. She isolated him from his few friends, creating petty arguments and misunderstandings until they eventually drifted away. She wanted him all to herself, not out of love, but out of a desire to control her investment. Alistair, lost in his work, barely noticed the changes. He was grateful for Isabella's attentiveness, for her willingness to handle the mundane details of their life, freeing him to focus on his art. He saw her actions as a manifestation of her love, a testament to her devotion. He was a lamb, blissfully unaware of the butcher's sharpening knife. The final piece of her monstrous plan fell into place when Alistair was diagnosed with a mild heart condition. It was nothing life-threatening, the doctor had assured them, easily managed with medication and a healthy lifestyle. But to Isabella, the diagnosis was a gift. A pre-written narrative for a tragedy. A way to commit the perfect murder. A murder that would look like nothing more than a sad, unfortunate, and entirely natural death. She began to research his medication, its side effects, its interactions with other substances. She learned about dosages, about how a slight increase could have devastating consequences. She became an expert in the subtle art of poisoning, not with exotic toxins, but with the very pills that were meant to keep her husband alive. The transformation was complete. The loving wife was gone, replaced by a predator patiently stalking its prey. She would play the part of the devoted caregiver to the very end. Her grief a meticulously rehearsed performance for an audience of unsuspecting friends and authorities. She would be the tragic widow, left alone to safeguard the legacy of her brilliant husband. A legacy that would make her one of the richest women in the world. The loft, once a sanctuary of creativity and love, had become a gilded cage, and Alistair, the artist who saw the world with such clarity and depth, was blind to the bars that were closing in around him. He continued to paint, to pour his soul onto his canvases, creating the very masterpieces that would be his death warrant. And as he painted, his wife watched, her eyes no longer filled with adoration, but with the cold, hard glitter of $4 billion. The stage was set, the script was written, and Isabella was ready for her final, terrible performance. The only thing left was to choose the perfect moment for the curtain to fall. The day Isabella chose for Alistair's death was a Tuesday in late autumn. The sky was a painter's gray, a flat, melancholic canvas that mirrored the mood she intended to create. She had chosen the date with the same meticulous care she had applied to every other aspect of her plan. It was the anniversary of their first meeting, a detail she knew would add a touch of poignant irony to the tragedy, a detail that would be repeated in the sympathetic newspaper articles that would follow. The morning began as any other. She woke before him, slipping out of bed to prepare his breakfast. He was a man of simple habits, his routine as predictable as the sunrise. A cup of black coffee, 2 slices of toast with marmalade, and the morning paper. And, of course, his medication. A small, blue pill for his heart condition. A pill that he trusted her to give him each day. For weeks, she had been subtly altering his dosage. She had purchased a jeweler's scale, a tool of minute precision, and had been carefully shaving off a minuscule amount of the active ingredient from his daily pill, replacing it with a harmless filler. The effect was a slow, almost imperceptible weakening of his heart. He had been complaining of fatigue, of shortness of breath, symptoms he attributed to his workload, to the long hours he spent standing at his easel. Isabella had feigned concern, urging him to rest, to take it easy, all the while knowing that her slow poisoning was working exactly as she had planned. But on this Tuesday there would be a change. The pill she placed beside his coffee cup was different. It was a capsule, identical in appearance to the ones he occasionally took for headaches. But this one was filled not with aspirin, but with a crushed, concentrated dose of his heart medication, a dose many times what he was prescribed. It was a lethal cocktail, designed to induce a massive and seemingly natural heart attack. She watched him from the kitchen as he sat at the dining table, the morning light casting long shadows across the room. He looked tired, his face pale, but he smiled when he saw her. It was a genuine, loving smile, a smile that would have shattered the resolve of a lesser monster. But Isabella was no lesser monster. She had hollowed out her heart, scooped out any lingering traces of love or compassion, and had filled the void with the cold, hard weight of her ambition. "You look tired, my love," she said, her voice a symphony of feigned concern. "Perhaps you should take a day off. We could go for a drive, get some fresh air." He shook his head, a familiar, stubborn glint in his eye. "I can't. I'm close, Izzy. I'm so close to finishing the triptych. I can feel it. It's the best thing I've ever done." "I know, darling," she said, her voice soft as velvet. "Just promise me you'll take it easy." He nodded, swallowed his pills with a sip of coffee, and stood up to head to his studio. "I promise," he said, kissing her on the forehead. It was the last time he would ever touch her. Isabella spent the rest of the morning creating her alibi. She made a series of phone calls, her voice cheerful and light, She called her hairdresser to schedule an appointment for the following day. She called a friend to make plans for lunch later in the week. She called a gallery to inquire about an upcoming exhibition. Each call was a carefully placed brick in the wall of normalcy she was building around herself. At precisely 11:30 a.m., she left the loft. She had a lunch reservation at a fashionable restaurant on the other side of town, a place where she was known, a place where she would be seen. She took a taxi, making sure to engage the driver in a memorable conversation about the weather, the traffic, the rising cost of living. She wanted to be remembered. The lunch was a masterful performance. She met a group of acquaintances, women from the fringes of the art world whose lives revolved around gallery openings and society gossip. She was vivacious, witty, charming. She ordered champagne, regaling the table with amusing anecdotes about Alistair's artistic eccentricities. She was the picture of a woman without a care in the world, a woman whose husband was, at that very moment, dying alone in his studio. She lingered over coffee, drawing out the meal as long as she possibly could. She checked her watch frequently, a subtle but noticeable gesture of a wife who was expecting to meet her husband later in the day. At 2:15 p.m., she finally made her excuses and left the restaurant. But she didn't go straight home. Her plan required a period of unaccounted-for time, a window in which the tragedy could have occurred. She went to a museum, a place where she could lose herself in the crowd, a place where she could be both present and invisible. She wandered through the galleries, her mind a cold, calm sea of calculation. She wasn't looking at the art. She was looking at her future, a future that was being purchased with the life of the man who loved her. At 4:45 p.m., she left the museum and hailed another taxi. This time, she was silent, her face a mask of anxious anticipation. The performance was about to enter its final, crucial act. She let herself into the loft, the silence that greeted her a confirmation that her plan had succeeded. "Alistair?" she called out, her voice laced with a carefully manufactured note of concern. "Darling, I'm home." There was no answer. She walked through the loft, her footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. She went to his studio, the place where he spent most of his waking hours. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, and there he was. He was lying on the floor, his body contorted in a way that spoke of a sudden, violent agony. His hand was outstretched, as if reaching for something, and his face was frozen in an expression of shock and pain. An overturned glass of water lay beside him, the water having soaked into the wooden floorboards. His last painting, the triptych he had been so excited about, stood on the easel, unfinished. For a moment, a flicker of something real, something human, pierced through Isabella's cold resolve. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was not an abstract concept anymore. This was her husband, dead on the floor. This was the reality of what she had done. But then the image of the $4 billion, the number that had become her mantra, her god, flashed in her mind. It was a talisman against the weakness of sentimentality, against the inconvenient intrusion of a conscience. She took a deep, steadying breath, and the moment of humanity passed. The actress was back on stage. She didn't touch anything. She had done her research. The crime scene, the scene of the accident, had to be preserved. She backed out of the room, her movements slow and deliberate. Then, she took out her phone and dialed the emergency number. Her voice, when she spoke to the operator, was a masterpiece of controlled hysteria. It was the voice of a woman who was trying to be brave, to be coherent, in the face of an unimaginable horror. She choked back sobs, her words punctuated by gasps of carefully timed grief. The paramedics and the police arrived within minutes. They found her crumpled on the floor of the living room, a picture of a distraught, heartbroken wife. She was unable to speak, her body racked with tremors. It was a convincing and entirely false display of shock. The initial assessment of the scene was exactly what she had hoped for. A middle-aged man with a known heart condition, found dead in his studio. It was a tragedy, yes, but not a suspicious one. The paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene, The cause of death listed as a probable massive coronary artery thrombosis. The police were gentle with her, their questions soft and respectful. She played her part to perfection. She told them about his heart condition, about his recent complaints of fatigue. She told them how he had been working too hard, how she had begged him to rest. Her lies were wrapped in the genuine emotion of a grieving widow, and they were swallowed whole. In the days that followed, Isabella was the very model of a bereaved woman. A stream of friends and well-wishers flowed through the loft, offering their condolences, their casseroles, their useless platitudes. She received them all with a quiet, dignified sorrow. She wept, but not too much. She spoke of Alistair in hushed, reverent tones, her voice filled with a mixture of love and loss. She handled the funeral arrangements with a numb efficiency that many mistook for strength. She chose a simple, elegant service, one that she knew Alistair would have hated. He had been a man who loathed ceremony, who found funerals to be a barbaric and morbid spectacle. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about her, about cementing her image as the devoted, grieving widow. She stood at the graveside, a solitary figure in black, a veil obscuring her face. She allowed herself a single, theatrical tear to trace a path down her cheek as the coffin was lowered into the ground. She was aware of the cameras, the reporters who had gathered to cover the death of the suddenly famous artist. His death, just as the appraiser had predicted, had created a media frenzy. The story of the reclusive genius, dead at the height of his powers, was irresistible. And as the art world mourned the loss of a great talent, the value of his work began to skyrocket. The whispers of the $4 billion collection began to circulate, first as a rumor, then as a credible possibility. Gallery owners, auction houses, and collectors from around the world began to circle, their greed a palpable buzz in the air. Isabella, the sole heir to this unimaginable fortune, played her part with masterful skill. She spoke of her desire to preserve his legacy, to honor his memory. She hinted at the creation of a foundation, a museum dedicated to his work. She was the reluctant custodian of a cultural treasure, a woman burdened by the weight of her husband's genius. The police officially closed the case a week after the funeral. The coroner's report confirmed their initial assessment: death by natural causes. A massive heart attack, brought on by a pre-existing condition and exacerbated by overwork. There was no reason to suspect otherwise. Isabella had committed the perfect crime. She was alone now, in the silent loft, surrounded by the fruits of her husband's labor, the source of her future wealth. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil, once a scent she had associated with him, was now the smell of money. She walked through the studio, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. She ran a hand over the surface of his unfinished triptych, the last thing his hands had touched. She felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, no sadness. Only a cold, thrilling sense of triumph. She had done it. She was free. She was rich. She had everything she had ever wanted. But as she stood there, in the silent, tomb-like studio, a faint, almost imperceptible unease began to creep into the edges of her victory. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense of a loose thread in a perfectly woven tapestry. She dismissed it as a symptom of her recent ordeal, a lingering echo of the stress and the grief she had so convincingly faked. She was wrong. It was not an echo. It was a premonition, because in the cold, methodical world of a police investigation, a world that Isabella had so successfully manipulated, one small, insignificant detail had been overlooked. A detail that would eventually unravel her perfect crime and expose the monstrous truth that lay hidden beneath the canvas of her deceit. A single, overturned glass of water. For weeks, Isabella lived in the golden glow of her triumph. The world, it seemed, had accepted her narrative without question. She was the tragic widow, the reluctant heiress, the devoted guardian of a priceless artistic legacy. The sympathy that flowed towards her was a warm, intoxicating bath, washing away any lingering traces of her crime. The art world was at her feet, and the numbers being discussed in hushed, reverent tones were even more staggering than she had imagined. 4 billion was no longer a wild exaggeration. It was a conservative estimate. Her performance was flawless. She gave a series of carefully managed interviews, her face a mask of dignified grief, her words a moving tribute to the man she had murdered. She spoke of his passion, his dedication, his gentle soul. She even managed to produce tears on cue, a skill she had honed in front of her bathroom mirror. She was, in every sense of the word, untouchable. But while Isabella was busy planning the auction that would make her one of the richest women in the world, a lone, dissenting voice was beginning to emerge from the chorus of acceptance. Detective Miles Corbin was a man who didn't believe in perfect stories. He was a homicide detective in his late 50s, a man with a weary, bloodhound face and eyes that had seen the very worst of human nature. He had been one of the officers who had responded to Isabella's frantic 911 call, and while everything about the scene had pointed to a natural death, something had felt wrong to him. It was a gut feeling, a professional intuition that had been honed over 30 years of investigating the darkest corners of the human heart. It was the glass of water. It was a small, insignificant detail, one that everyone else had dismissed. But it bothered him. The glass was lying on its side, near Alistair's outstretched hand. The official report had noted it as a sign of his desperate, final moments, a man reaching for water as his heart gave out. But Corbin had seen something else. The water had soaked into the floorboards, but the pattern of the stain was wrong. It was too concentrated, too neat. If a man in the throes of a massive heart attack had knocked over a glass of water, the spill would have been chaotic, scattered. This was different. This looked as if the glass had been gently placed on its side. It was a tiny, almost laughable discrepancy, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Corbin's mind. He began to dig, quietly, unofficially, into the life of Alistair and Isabella Finch. He started with the coroner's report. Everything was in order. The cause of death was clear. But Corbin, on a hunch, requested a more detailed toxicology screening, one that would look for substances beyond the standard panel. While he waited for the results, he began to piece together a picture of the couple. He interviewed their friends, their neighbors, the gallery owners who had known them. The image that emerged was the one that Isabella had so carefully crafted, the devoted wife and the reclusive, brilliant artist. But Corbin was a man who knew how to read between the lines, how to detect the faint, discordant notes in a seemingly harmonious melody. He found it in the words of one of Alistair's oldest friends, a fellow artist who had been pushed away in the months leading up to his death. Isabella changed, the friend told him. She became possessive. She built a wall around him. I thought it was love, but now, I don't know, felt more like ownership. He found it in the financial records of the couple. Alistair had been indifferent to money, but Isabella had been secretly consulting with wealth managers and investment bankers for over a year. She had been planning for a future of immense wealth, a future that didn't seem to include her husband. And then the results of the toxicology report came back. And with them, the first real crack in Isabella's perfect story. The lab had found an unusually high concentration of Alistair's heart medication in his system, a level far exceeding his prescribed dosage. But more telling was what they didn't find. The medication he took daily was a slow-release formula, designed to maintain a steady level in the bloodstream over a 24-hour period. The substance found in his stomach was a pure, unadulterated, and massive dose of the active ingredient, something that could only have been ingested in a single concentrated form. It was the equivalent of taking a month's worth of pills at once. It was a smoking gun. A natural heart attack was no longer a possibility. Alistair Finch had been poisoned. The case was officially reopened. The death was now a homicide. And Isabella Finch, the grieving widow, was now the primary suspect. Corbin and his team descended on the loft, this time not as sympathetic officers offering condolences, but as investigators searching for evidence of a murder. The studio, once a sanctuary of art, was now a crime scene. They meticulously examined every inch of the room, every tube of paint, every brush, every canvas. And then they found it, hidden in the back of a dusty, forgotten cupboard, was a small digital scale, a jeweler's scale capable of measuring in milligrams. It was the kind of tool that had no place in a painter's studio. When the forensics team analyzed the surface of the scale, they found microscopic traces of two substances, the active ingredient of Alistair's heart medication and a harmless, inert filler. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Corbin now had a theory, a monstrous, and yet horribly plausible narrative of what had happened. Isabella had been slowly poisoning her husband, weakening his heart, while simultaneously planning for the massive inheritance she knew would come with his death. She had then delivered the final, lethal dose, disguised in a capsule, and had staged the scene to look like a natural death. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling. Corbin knew it wasn't enough to guarantee a conviction. He needed something more. He needed to break Isabella's composure, to find the flaw in her perfect performance. He brought her in for questioning. She arrived at the police station with her high-priced lawyer, her face a mask of bewildered indignation. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was the wronged woman, the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. Corbin let her talk. He let her spin her web of lies, her voice calm and steady. She denied everything. She had no idea how Alistair could have ingested such a large dose of his medication. It must have been a tragic accident, a moment of confusion. The scale? It was for mixing pigments, she claimed, a tool of her husband's trade. But Corbin was watching her eyes, and in them he saw not confusion, but the cold, hard glint of a predator. He decided to take a gamble. "We found your search history, Isabella," he said, his voice quiet and even. It was a bluff. They hadn't been able to access her personal computer yet. "We know you were researching lethal doses of his medication. We know you were looking up ways to induce a heart attack." It was a shot in the dark, but it hit its mark. For the first time, a flicker of fear, of panic, crossed her face. Her composure, for a fraction of a second, cracked. And in that crack, Corbin saw the truth. The trial of Isabella Finch was a media sensation. It was a story that had everything: art, money, sex, and murder. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision, presenting the toxicology report, the jeweler's scale, the testimony of Alistair's estranged friend. They painted a picture of a cold, calculating, and greedy woman who had murdered her husband for his art. Isabella's defense team was slick and expensive. They attacked the prosecution's case as a web of circumstantial evidence and unfounded speculation. They portrayed Isabella as a loving wife, a victim of a tragic accident that was now being twisted into a sensationalized murder mystery. Isabella herself was the star witness for her own defense. She was poised, articulate, and utterly convincing on the stand. Her performance was so masterful that for a time, it seemed as if she might actually be acquitted. But the prosecution had one last card to play: a surprise witness. He was a disgruntled former employee of the international auction house that Isabella had secretly consulted. He had been fired for a minor infraction, and he had a score to settle. He came forward with a series of emails that he had kept as an insurance policy. They were from a Jane Doe, an anonymous client who had been inquiring about the potential value of a massive private collection of art. The emails contained detailed photographs of Alistair's paintings, the very ones that Isabella had taken. And in the final, damning email, Jane Doe had asked a chillingly specific question. Hypothetically, what would be the impact on the value of the collection if the artist were to die suddenly and tragically? The courtroom was stunned into silence. The email was a confession in all but name. It was the voice of a murderer, coolly and calmly calculating the profits of her crime. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of the unfathomable coldness of her crime, of a greed so profound that it had eclipsed the very essence of her humanity. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. As she was led out of the courtroom, her face was no longer a mask of composure. It was a canvas of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had gambled everything, and she had lost. The $4 billion fortune, the prize for which she had sold her soul, would be placed in a trust, its future to be decided by the courts. She would never see a penny of it. In the end, Alistair Finch, the man who had cared so little for money, had the last laugh. His legacy was secure, his art celebrated around the world. And his wife, the woman who had seen his genius only as a means to an end, was left with nothing but the four cold walls of a prison cell, a gilded cage of her own making. The price of her greed was a debt she would spend the rest of her life paying, in a currency of regret and squandered humanity, a price far greater than even $4 billion.